Special Agent Bruce Mouw sat in his car across from the Ravenite Social Club, watching John Gotti step out of a black Lincoln. It was February 12, 1987, and Mouw had no idea he was staring at the man who would consume the next 5 years of his life. What started as a routine surveillance assignment would become the most personal investigation in FBI history. Two men on opposite sides of the law, locked in a chess match where the stakes weren't just careers or freedom. They were fighting for something deeper: respect, understanding, and the dangerous recognition that your enemy might be the only person who truly knows who you are. Bruce Mouw wasn't supposed to be hunting John Gotti. In 1984, he was a 15-year veteran assigned to white-collar crime, insurance fraud, corporate embezzlement, clean cases with paper trails and cooperative witnesses. His office walls were lined with certificates, commendations from successful prosecutions of crooked executives and tax evaders. Mouw prided himself on methodical investigation, building cases brick by brick until the evidence was unshakable. But the Bureau had a problem. Every FBI task force assigned to the Gambino family had failed. 3 separate task forces in 5 years had produced nothing but frustrated agents and closed files. The traditional approach wasn't working. Gotti seemed to anticipate every move, counter every strategy, neutralize every informant before they could provide useful intelligence. Agent Jerry Sullivan, the previous Gambino task force leader, had suffered what the Bureau politely called investigative fatigue. In reality, he'd had a breakdown after 18 months of chasing shadows. While Gotti's organization grew stronger and more sophisticated, Sullivan's final report was damning. The subject operates with a level of security awareness and strategic thinking that exceeds our current operational capabilities. The failure wasn't just professional. It was personal. Gotti had become a media sensation, the dapper Don who beat every federal case brought against him. Newspaper headlines celebrated his courtroom victories, while FBI morale plummeted. The most powerful law enforcement agency in the world was being made to look incompetent by a street criminal from Queens. The brass needed someone different, someone who understood that organized crime wasn't just about violence and intimidation. It was about systems, hierarchies, and the psychology of power. Mouw had spent years studying criminal organizations like they were corporations. He knew that taking down a family required more than wiretaps and informants. It required understanding how they thought, how they communicated, how they maintained loyalty in a world built on betrayal. When SAC Bruce Perrotta called Mouw into his office that October morning, the assignment was simple. I want you to study John Gotti like he's your dissertation subject. Learn everything: how he thinks, how he operates, who he trusts. We're not looking for quick arrests. We're building a case that will put him away forever. But what nobody knew, what Mouw himself didn't realize, was that when you study someone that intensely, when you spend years trying to think like them, predict their moves, understand their motivations, something dangerous happens. The line between hunter and hunted begins to blur. Mouw's first breakthrough came through technology the mob had never seen before. Instead of relying on informants who could be discovered and eliminated, he pioneered what would become known as electronic surveillance packages, miniaturized recording devices that could be planted in walls, cars, meeting rooms. Technology so advanced it was still classified in most federal agencies. The Ravenite Social Club became his laboratory. The narrow building at 2047 Mulberry Street in Little Italy was Gotti's unofficial headquarters. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the most powerful crime bosses in New York gathered there to discuss business, settle disputes, and plan operations that generated millions in illegal revenue. Traditional FBI surveillance had always been external. Agents sitting in cars, watching who came and went, taking photographs. But Mouw understood that real intelligence came from listening, from understanding not just what decisions were made, but how they were made, the psychology behind the power. The first bug was planted in November 1984. It took 6 months of planning, studying the building's layout, identifying when it was empty, coordinating with utility workers who could access the basement. The operation itself was a masterclass in precision timing and technological innovation. Mouw worked with NSA technical specialists who had developed recording devices smaller than matchboxes, with battery life measured in months rather than days. The challenge wasn't just placement, it was creating a system that could transmit clear audio through the building's century-old brick walls, while avoiding detection by increasingly sophisticated counter-surveillance equipment. The Ravenite had been swept for bugs 3 times by Gotti's security team, led by a former NYPD detective named Frank DeSico, who understood federal surveillance techniques better than most agents. Every conventional hiding spot had been identified and neutralized. The new bugs had to be placed in locations so unexpected, so technically challenging to access, that even paranoid professionals wouldn't think to look there. The final solution was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of hiding devices in obvious locations like light fixtures or electrical outlets, Mouw's team embedded them within the building's heating system, inside cast iron radiators that had been there since 1920. The metal provided natural insulation against detection equipment, while the heating pipes created an undetectable transmission network throughout the building. When they finally activated the device, what they heard changed everything they thought they knew about organized crime. The audio quality was pristine, capturing not just words but inflections, pauses, the subtle power dynamics that revealed who was really making decisions and why. John Gotti wasn't the crude, violent stereotype the media portrayed. He was a strategist. Listening to those early tapes, Mouw heard a man who understood psychology, who could read people's motivations, who made decisions based on long-term thinking rather than emotion. Gotti was building something that went beyond traditional organized crime. He was creating a brand, a mythology that would outlast any individual arrest or prosecution. But there was something else in those recordings that surprised Mouw. Gotti talked about the FBI, not with the usual contempt or dismissal, but with professional respect. He knew agents were watching him. He knew about surveillance techniques, legal procedures, the limitations of federal prosecution, and he was fascinated by the minds trying to bring him down. The feds, they think different than cops, Gotti said in one conversation that Mouw would replay dozens of times. Cops want to catch you in the act. Feds want to understand your whole operation. They're playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. That's what makes them dangerous. But Gotti wasn't just observing FBI tactics. He was actively studying them. In another recording from March 1985, Mouw heard Gotti discussing federal surveillance techniques with the precision of an academy instructor. They don't just want one arrest, Gotti explained to his lieutenants. They want to map the entire structure, every connection, every revenue stream. They'll spend 2 years gathering intelligence before they move, because when they move, they want everything to fall at once. What fascinated Mouw was Gotti's respect for federal law enforcement methodology. Unlike other crime bosses who dismissed agents as college boys playing gangster, Gotti appreciated the intellectual challenge they represented. He began implementing counter-surveillance techniques that were remarkably sophisticated, rotating meeting locations daily, using different routes to identical destinations, employing distraction vehicles to confuse surveillance teams. Most tellingly, Gotti started limiting conversations to essential business only. Personal discussions, family matters, anything that might humanize him to listening agents was moved to outdoor locations where electronic surveillance was impossible. It was as if he understood that the greatest danger wasn't legal prosecution but the possibility that his enemies might begin to understand him as a person rather than just a target. What Gotti didn't know was that Agent Mouw was listening to every word. And what Mouw didn't realize was that he was beginning to think the same way about his target. This wasn't just another criminal to arrest. This was a mind worth studying, opponent worthy of respect. By 1986, Mouw had assembled the most comprehensive intelligence file in FBI history on a single organized crime figure. Thousands of hours of recordings, hundreds of photographs, detailed psychological profiles of Gotti's associates and family members. He knew Gotti's routines better than Gotti's own wife. He could predict where Gotti would be on any given day, who he would meet with, what topics would be discussed. But knowledge brought unexpected consequences. The more Mouw learned about Gotti, the more he understood why this man had inspired such loyalty, such fear, such fascination. Gotti wasn't just a criminal, he was a leader who had taken a dying organization and rebuilt it based on principles that, while illegal, demanded a kind of respect, loyalty, honor, keeping your word even when it cost you everything, taking care of your people even when it put you at risk. These weren't just mob values, they were leadership principles that Mouw, despite himself, began to admire. The turning point came in March 1987. Mouw was reviewing surveillance footage when he noticed something unusual. Gotti had changed his routine. Instead of his usual Tuesday meeting at the Ravenite, he was walking alone through Washington Square Park at 2 a.m. No bodyguards, no associates. Just a man who seemed to be thinking. Against all protocol, Mouw decided to follow him personally. Not to arrest him, not to gather evidence, but out of pure curiosity. What did John Gotti do when he thought nobody was watching? What Mouw witnessed that night stayed with him for the rest of his career. Gotti stopped at a bench where an elderly homeless man was sleeping. Instead of walking past, Gotti woke the man up, sat down beside him, and they talked for almost an hour. When Gotti left, he had given the man his coat, his wallet, and directions to a shelter that Gotti apparently supported financially. This wasn't for show. There were no cameras, no witnesses except one FBI agent hidden in the shadows. This was John Gotti when he thought he was truly alone. And what Mouw saw was a man carrying the weight of leadership, responsibility, and a moral code that didn't fit any criminal profile he had ever studied. The conversation Mouw heard that night would haunt him for years. The homeless man, a Korean War veteran named Eddie, who'd lost everything to alcoholism and bad luck, spoke about his family, his regrets, his struggle to maintain dignity in a world that had forgotten him. Gotti listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and offered not just money but genuine understanding. "You served your country," Gotti told Eddie. "That means something. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't. Tomorrow, you go to that shelter, you get clean, you start over. A man gets as many chances as he's willing to take." When Eddie protested that he'd failed too many times, that people like him didn't get second chances, Gotti's response revealed something profound about his worldview. The only failures are the ones who stop trying, and the ones who abandon their people. Everything else is just learning. That night changed everything. When Mouw returned to his office, he found himself unable to write his usual surveillance report. How do you document the moment when you realize your target isn't who you thought he was? How do you explain to your supervisors that the most dangerous criminal in New York might also be one of the most principled men you've ever observed? For weeks afterward, Mouw found himself researching Gotti's background, not for evidence of crimes, but trying to understand the experiences that had shaped such an unusual moral framework. The picture that emerged was complex. A man who had grown up in poverty, who had seen how indifferent institutions could be to human suffering, and who had decided to create his own system of justice and protection. The investigation continued, but now it had become personal for both men. Gotti began leaving subtle messages, signs that he knew he was being watched by someone who understood the game they were playing. A newspaper left open to a crossword puzzle, with answers that spelled out, "Respect the rules." A dinner receipt from a restaurant where Mouw had eaten lunch the previous day. Small gestures that said, "I know you're there, and I know you're worthy of this challenge." Mouw began responding in kind. Evidence that could have led to immediate arrests was set aside in favor of continuing the surveillance. Warrants that could have been executed were delayed. Both men seemed to understand that they were engaged in something more valuable than a typical law enforcement operation. They were testing each other's intelligence, patience, and professional ethics. The psychological chess match reached its climax in December 1989. Mouw had finally gathered enough evidence to secure indictments that would put Gotti away for life. Racketeering charges based on 3 years of electronic surveillance, witness testimony from multiple cooperating suspects, and financial records that proved a pattern of criminal enterprise. But before filing the charges, something unprecedented happened. Mouw requested a face-to-face meeting with his target. Not an interrogation, not an arrest, but a conversation between two professionals who had spent 5 years trying to understand each other. The meeting took place in a federal courthouse conference room on December 15, 1989. No lawyers present, no recording devices, just two men sitting across a table from each other for the first and only time. What they discussed has never been officially documented, but both men later acknowledged that it changed their understanding of law enforcement, criminal justice, and the thin line between those who enforce the law and those who break it. The conversation began formally, almost ritualistically. "Agent Mouw," Gotti said, extending his hand. "I've been looking forward to meeting the man who's been studying me so carefully." "Mr. Gotti," Mouw replied, accepting the handshake, "I have to say it's been the most challenging investigation of my career." What followed was an hour-long discussion that ranged from surveillance techniques to leadership philosophy, from the nature of loyalty to the price of power. Neither man tried to convince the other to change sides or reveal information. Instead, they engaged in something rarer, a genuine exchange of professional respect between worthy adversaries. "You know what I've always wondered," Gotti said at one point, "is whether you understand what it means to be responsible for people the system has forgotten, not just their safety, but their dignity, their hope." Mouw's response surprised even himself. "I've come to understand that leadership isn't about the badge or the title. It's about whether people believe you'll keep your word when keeping it costs you everything." The recognition in Gotti's eyes at that moment was something Mouw would never forget. Two men from completely different worlds had found common ground in their understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than themselves. As the meeting concluded, Gotti made one final observation that would stay with Mouw for decades. "You know what the real difference is between us, Agent Mouw? You believe the system can be fixed from within. I believe it has to be replaced. But we both believe it has to be better than what we inherited." Gotti was indicted 3 days later. The trial would become the most closely watched organized crime prosecution of the decade. But for both men, the real drama had already concluded in that conference room. They had gained something more valuable than a conviction or an acquittal. They had gained mutual respect. Agent Mouw would later say that John Gotti was the most intelligent criminal he ever investigated, and the only one who made him better at his job by forcing him to think beyond traditional law enforcement techniques. The investigation had changed Mouw's approach to every subsequent case, teaching him that understanding your subject's motivations was more valuable than simply documenting their actions. Gotti, speaking from prison years later, said that Agent Mouw was the only federal agent who understood that organized crime wasn't about violence or greed, but about leadership, loyalty, and maintaining order in a world that had forgotten those values. In letters to family members that would later surface, Gotti wrote, "Most cops see criminals. Mouw saw people who had chosen a different path to the same destination, protecting those they cared about." The investigation that began with surveillance and suspicion ended with understanding. Two men from opposite sides of the law discovered that their dedication to their principles, their commitment to excellence in their chosen professions, and their willingness to respect worthy adversaries made them more alike than different. Years after Gotti's conviction, Mouw found himself defending aspects of his former target's character to colleagues who couldn't understand how he could respect someone he'd helped send to prison for life. "You can disagree with someone's methods," Mouw would explain, without failing to recognize their principles. Gotti never pretended to be something he wasn't. He had a code, and he lived by it, even when it cost him everything. When Gotti was sentenced to life in prison, Mouw was in the courtroom. When Mouw retired from the FBI in 1997, Gotti sent a letter congratulating him on a distinguished career. The letter, which Mouw kept in his private files, contained a single line that summarized their entire relationship. In a world full of people who stand for nothing, it was an honor to face someone who stood for something, even when we stood on opposite sides. Both men understood that their 5-year chess match had been the defining challenge of their professional lives, and that neither would have been complete without the other. They had pushed each other to levels of excellence that neither would have achieved alone. Adversaries who had made each other better at their chosen professions. The story of Agent Bruce Mouw and John Gotti proves something rarely discussed in law enforcement circles. Sometimes the greatest respect comes from your greatest adversary. Sometimes understanding your enemy teaches you more about yourself than victory ever could. And sometimes the most dangerous game isn't about winning or losing, it's about recognizing excellence, even when you find it on the opposite side.